a place the Lakota called the Greasy Grass. On this site, on a summer day in 1876, the Lakota Indians defeated famous Civil War hero General Armstrong Custer and approximately 260 soldiers. It was, to that date, the greatest defeat ever suffered by the United States Army. A bloody fight history books have since called the Battle of Little Big Horn. By the end of the 1700s, a large tribe of Indians had become a powerful and expanding force among the tribes on the northern Great Plains. They called themselves the Lakota, a word meaning friend. Settlers knew them as Sioux, a word meaning enemy. Skilled hunters and proud warriors, the Lakota dominated the region. For a Lakota warrior to die in battle was an honor, and warfare was to be conducted in ways that would preserve that honor. Their bravery was reflected in the Lakota saying, often shouted as a battle cry, "Today is a good day to die." In the late 1700s, at the same time as the colonists far to the east were preparing to declare their independence from England, the Lakota arrived at Pahasapa, the Black Hills of South Dakota. For the Lakota, Pahasapa was their most sacred land, the center of Lakota spiritual life. For the next 75 years, the Lakota would thrive on the Great Plains. They hunted many species of the abundant wildlife of the region, but buffalo hunting was the principal support of the Lakota way of life. For the Lakota, buffalo were rich in spiritual meaning and endowed with supernatural powers. The Lakota made use of every part of the mighty animal for food, clothing, and lodging. Nothing was allowed to go to waste. In the 1840s, prospectors began to cross Lakota hunting lands while traveling west in search of gold. While making their way through, they killed large numbers of buffalo, often for sport, and often leaving wasted buffalo carcasses to rot. For the Lakota, such waste was not only unwise, but a sinful insult to the Creator. The Lakota way of life was in danger. By August 1868, Lakota War Chief Red Cloud had won a great victory. He and his warriors had forced the United States Army to close its forts along the famous Bozeman Trail. The trail had served as the only route for prospectors and settlers traveling to and from the gold fields of Montana. Cutting straight through the heart of the Lakota Buffalo Range, the trail had been a disaster for the tribe. But the American government was forced to meet Red Cloud's demands, and the victorious warriors joyously burned the abandoned forts. September 1868. Believing he had won the war and turned back the American westward expansion, Red Cloud traveled to Fort Laramie and signed a treaty he thought would forever preserve his people's victory.
You can say that Red Cloud won that war. If you look at the long view, of course, Red Cloud lost that war because there were other features of that treaty that set off a process that in the end helped to doom the Lakota as an independent people.
The treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, an area which included all of present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River. The government also agreed to provide the Indians with life-sustaining rations until they became self-supporting. After 2 years of reservation life, 2 years in which treaty goods had shown up late or in smaller than promised amounts or not at all, Red Cloud traveled to Washington to express Lakota dissatisfactions to President Ulysses S. Grant.
In 1868, men came out and brought paper. We could not read them, and they did not tell us truly what was in them. We thought the treaty was to remove the forts, and that we should then cease from fighting. When I reached Washington, the Great Father showed me that the interpreters had deceived me. All I want is what is right and just.
Red Cloud returned to the reservation disheartened and never again went to war. But other Lakota were still willing to carry on the fight for justice and freedom. As many as 3,000 Lakota had refused to sign the 1868 treaty and continued to live in the Powder River region, designated by the U.S. as unceded Indian Territory. These Lakota turned to Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, 2 honored war chiefs for leadership. Crazy Horse forcefully stated his people's position.
We did not ask you white men to come here. The Great Spirit gave us this country as a home. We do not want your civilization. We would live as our fathers did, and their fathers before them.
The already strained peace was shattered when gold was found in the sacred Black Hills, within the boundaries of land recognized as Lakota Reservation in the 1868 treaty. Under pressure from gold seekers to seize the Black Hills from the Lakota, the United States government offered to buy the land the Lakota knew as Paha Sapa. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were opposed to selling the sacred land. But the government was not dissuaded. The religious concerns of the Lakota were not of primary concern to the settlers and prospectors pushing the government, nor were the terms of the Treaty of 1868. Newspaper editorials contributed to the climate of hostility toward the Lakota.
What shall be done with these Indian dogs in our manger? They are too lazy and too much like mere animals to cultivate the fertile.
There was nothing that could stir an irrational mania quite like the very hint of gold in some recess of the West. And as one of the senators commented, the American people will override every Indian tribe and every regiment of the U.S. Army to get at where the gold is, and there is no stopping them.
On December 1st, 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum to the Lakota. Come to the reservation within 60 days or be considered hostile and at war. Few Lakota paid attention to the government's threats. The mission of doing battle with the formidable Lakota was given to General Custer, a well-known and popular hero of the Civil War. June 1876. Custer and the 7th Cavalry searched the northern plains for Lakota warriors. Not far from Custer's position, warriors following Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse joined together with a large number of disappointed reservation Lakotas and bands of Cheyenne. They were encamped along a river they called the Greasy Grass. Custer and his men knew it as the Little Bighorn. June 25, 1876. A scouting party sent by Custer spotted a handful of Lakota warriors and returned to report their position. The colonel decided to launch an attack, waiting for neither scouting intelligence nor reinforcements. With fierce strategy and skill, Sitting Bull's forces engaged Custer's army in numbers much larger than the lieutenant colonel had anticipated. Outmanned, outfought, and outmaneuvered, the 7th Cavalry was defeated in less than 2 days of fighting.
The Little Bighorn, of course, was the grandest victory in all the history of hostilities, all the history of Great Plains warfare. But in that victory lay the seeds of defeat, because that was so spectacular a disaster for the U.S. Army, so stunning to the American people in this centennial year when they're celebrating 100 years of independence, that there was an immediate demand for retaliation.
In the aftermath of the humiliating defeat and massacre suffered by Custer's forces, the government began an intense campaign of retaliation against non-reservation Indians. Ownership of the Black Hills was immediately seized, while the U.S. Army relentlessly pursued the Cheyenne and Lakota. With the cavalry in hot pursuit, the Cheyenne and Lakota broke up into smaller bands. Sitting Bull escaped to Canada, while Crazy Horse tried to evade capture in the Powder River country. Just 10 months after the victory at Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse and his exhausted and starving followers surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Though clearly defeated, Crazy Horse was still considered a dangerous man. According to eyewitnesses, Crazy Horse was stabbed in the back while in custody.
And if anybody deserves the last stand, anybody deserved the last stand, it was certainly somebody like Crazy Horse. He deserved to go down fighting, to the last, defending himself and his people. But to die the way that he did, without a way to physically defend himself, to have his arms pinned back and then to be stabbed, as history tells us, in the back, is probably the saddest thing about his whole life.
With Crazy Horse dead and Sitting Bull in Canada, the Lakota uprising eventually came to an end. Faced with growing demands and intrusions into their land, the proud Lakota had waged war against the invaders. Although victorious in battle, ultimately the Lakota could not succeed in their fight against the American expansion that destroyed them as an independent people. A place the Lakota called the Greasy Grass. On this site, on a summer day in 1876, the Lakota Indians defeated famous Civil War hero General Armstrong Custer and approximately 260 soldiers. It was, to that date, the greatest defeat ever suffered by the United States Army. A bloody fight history books have since called the Battle of Little Bighorn. By the end of the 1700s, a large tribe of Indians had become a powerful and expanding force among the tribes on the northern Great Plains. They called themselves the Lakota. In the late 1700s, at the same time as the colonists far to the east were preparing to declare their independence from England, the Lakota arrived at Pahasapa, the Black Hills of South Dakota. For the Lakota, Pahasapa was their most sacred land, the center of Lakota spiritual life. Lakota, a word meaning friend. Settlers knew them as Sioux, a word meaning enemy. Skilled hunters and proud warriors, the Lakota dominated the region. For a Lakota warrior to die in battle was an honor, and warfare was to be conducted in ways that would preserve that honor. Their bravery was reflected in the Lakota saying, often shouted as a battle cry, "Today is a good day to die." For the next 75 years, the Lakota would thrive on the Great Plains. They hunted many species of the abundant wildlife of the region, but buffalo hunting was the principal support of the Lakota way of life. For the Lakota,